looking at how to create a character, a human type character in Adobe Illustrator. And I want to talk to you about some of the tools that you could use to do something like this. I also want to review quickly some of the tools that you have learned in the past. For instance, illustrating on a piece of paper in really dark ink, maybe black marker, scanning that, using image trace to image trace that illustration, and you end up with a vector illustration. Another tool that you've learned recently is how to use your pencil tool that's on your keyboard. Remember, your pencil tool allows you to create a very organic shape, join that, and then fill that shape with color very easily. Another thing that we practice with is this idea of using the pen tool to create very geometric shapes. And then you could use your add anchor point tool to take those shapes and kind of move them around and make them round instead of geometric. So all of these are great tools to use, but it's important to know what tool to use for what situation. In our example today, we're going to create this illustration by combining a couple of things that you've already learned, but not using any of the techniques that I just mentioned, like scanning an illustration, the pencil tool, or the pen tool. In this illustration here, for an infograph, you would see 10 figures, 2 of which are grayed out and the rest are filled with green. And so, an example of a way this might be used in an infograph is, 8 out of 10 people care about the environment, for instance, or 80% of people care for the environment. These characters are green, these are grayed out, indicating that these are the population that would be caring for the environment. Of course, this would be accompanied by text over here on the right hand side or underneath it. So I'm going to ask you to walk through the process with me of creating one of those characters. And we're going to use this illustration that I took from the internet as a guide. For you could create a brand new document, Control N or File New. And that new document you could go ahead and make letter size. Should be the first option over here on the left hand side, and hit Create. We're going to start by using our shape tool, our rectangle tool. It's the 5th tool down over on our toolbar. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that, and I want to make sure that my colors are set to be default. So I'm going to choose this default option. That's white fill with a black stroke. So I'm going to go ahead and create a shape over here, out here on my stage. And this shape is going to represent the distance from this shoulder to the character's left shoulder, down to the hand, back to this side, and up to that character's right shoulder, our left. So that's what this shape represents. With that shape selected, I'd like you to go to Window, Color, and open up your color palette. And if yours doesn't look like mine, what you need to do is click on the hamburger icon and go to CMYK. And also choose the hamburger icon and go to Show Options. And yours should now look like mine. We'll talk about this for a moment because I want you to see what's going on in here. The shape that we currently have selected has a white fill and a black stroke. If we click on that fill color to bring it forward, we could change that fill color, and you'll see that out here on your stage, that box now turns to like a pinkish color. If we want to get rid of that pink color, we click on None to get rid of it. Now this is a hollow box just with a black outline. If we ever want to change the stroke or the outline color, we click on that to bring it forward, and then we could go through and modify the way that stroke color looks. I'm going to go ahead and leave mine at black. So that's what I'd like you to work with for now, is a black stroke with no fill on the shapes that we create. With our black arrow selected, go ahead and click on this path just to make sure it's selected. I'm going to have you copy it, Control C, and then paste in front, Control F. After you paste in front, what I'd like you to do is drag this right side in just a little bit, drag the left side in just a little bit, and drag this bottom part down. What this shape represents is the distance from kind of the collarbone to the collarbone down to the feet and then back up. So we have this vertical rectangle. Now don't worry too much if your shapes aren't perfectly centered. If they're off-centered, that's perfectly fine for now. Next thing I'm going to have you do is grab the white arrow, the direct selection tool, click on the bottom line, or deselect rather, click on the bottom line here and press delete. Deselect again, click on the bottom line and press delete. So what we've done now is we've removed a section of that rectangle. So now instead of having an enclosed box, now we have 1, 2, 3 lines like a horseshoe. And we go up, across, and down like a horseshoe. And this area is hollow. These represent the hands, or the arms rather, and the feet of our figure. Grab your black arrow, and I'm going to have you select both of these lines. Now, I'll just explain something here before we move forward, and you could just follow along. There's a drastic difference between these two tools, the selection tool and the direct selection tool. If I grab this direct selection tool, I could click on a point and move that point. Control Z to undo. If I click and drag with this direct selection tool, it only selects the things that I'm crossing over. So again, this point that I previously grabbed. If I use this same selection tool to click on this line, I can move that line. If I use the selection tool to click and hover over that line, it works the same way. So the white arrow only lets me select a point or a line segment. That said, there's other keys that I could hold down, like the Alt key to click on this, and that allows me to move the whole thing. Now the black arrow works differently. If I try to click on this point with the black arrow, the whole thing gets selected. Control Z. If I click and drag over just this little point, the whole thing gets selected. Control Z. If I click on this line segment, the whole thing gets selected. So the black arrow is all or nothing. If you touch this line or drag over the top of it, the whole thing will get selected. So you just have to pick which tool is going to work best for you when you're selecting things. I kind of like using a combination of both, but when I'm holding the black arrow, if I click and drag over all of these, I don't feel like I have to select everything. I could just cross both of these shapes and let go, and their entire shapes are selected. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Next, I'm going to have you go to Window. So go ahead and select these things with the black arrow. Go to Window, Stroke, and you're opening up your stroke panel now. And what the stroke panel allows us to do is change the qualities of this stroke. For instance, we could increase the weight drastically. You could also do that up here in your control. You could increase the stroke weight. I'm noticing that the end cap on these lines is very flat and geometric, but on the hands and feet of my character over here, they're very round. So what I'm going to do is change the cap to round, and I'm going to change the corner to round, and you can see the shoulders on my character transform. I'm liking the way that looks. So I mentioned previously not to worry if this thing was centered or not. That's okay. What we want to worry about is getting the proportions right for now. So I'm going to select the legs, and I'm going to drag them closer together, and then I'm going to increase the point size. I just want to get those proportions down. There we go. And so those legs could be just a little bit thicker. And I'm noticing that up here across the top of these, this line is kind of protruding over the top where these shoulders are for this other line. And so what I'm going to do is just grab this whole section, move it down just a little bit so that goes away. Perfect. So far it's looking pretty good. Again, it's not centered, and that's okay. I'll adjust that here in a minute. A couple more things we need to do. I'm going to grab my rectangle tool again, but this time, instead of working with a black stroke, I want to work with a black fill and no stroke. So what I'm going to do is click on this little arrow here, and that will swap the fill and stroke colors. And I'm going to create a little rectangle here to fill in this space where that torso would be. So that area here. Lastly, I'm going to use that rectangle tool to create an ellipse. If I click and drag, I could create an oval. If I hold shift down, I'm creating a perfect circle. There we go. So there's my figure. Now, it's still not centered, and that's okay. I want to show you a trick. If I copy this over, and you don't need to copy yours, but I just want to show you an example, and I move all of these pieces, just kind of explode them so they're separate from one another, I could see that I have 4 pieces to work with. If I grab all of those pieces, I want to align them centered. So I could go up and grab my Align palette up here, or I could go to Window, Align, and if I click my horizontal align center, all of these things now jump to the center and they're aligned really, really well for me. So I wasn't worried about that with this one because I could always grab it and choose Align Center, and they all kind of jump to the middle, which works out pretty cool for me. Go ahead and do that now. A couple more things and we're done with this illustration. Go ahead and grab all of the pieces here, and I'd like you to hit Control Y on your keyboard. What you're going to notice is the arms and the legs look different in this outline mode because we're actually looking at the paths. Whereas if I go back, Control Y, I see those the width on the strokes. Control Y to go back. So I want to modify this. I'm going to go up to Object, Path, Outline Stroke. And what that will do is take all of those pieces that I had previewed out here and turn them into paths. We've done this before in class. With this selected, I'll have you go to Window, Pathfinder, and open up your Pathfinder palette. And I'm going to have you choose this option that's called Unite. What that does is take every shape that's crossing paths and unites them into one. With these still selected, go ahead and hit Control G to group. So now we have one grouped illustration of a character that kind of looks like a human. I'm noticing that the armpits and the crotch area are very geometric, and so what I want to do is modify those. So I'm going to grab my white arrow, I'm going to click on one point, hold down Shift, click on a second point, and drag these down so I create a nice rounded area. I'm going to click on one point, hold down Shift, click on a second point, drag those down. And I'll do the same thing in this area here, click on one point, hold down Shift, click on a second point, drag down. Finally, I want to take these shoulders and make them a little bit more round. And so this time, instead of simply grabbing points, what I could do is use my white arrow to drag over all 4 of those points at one time simultaneously. I could drag this down to make those shoulders a little bit more rounded. I think that's looking pretty good. Finally, to finish this up, I'm going to have you take this object. If I select it, I'm going to hold down Alt, click and drag it to the right, and while I'm dragging, I'm going to hold Shift. Because holding Shift will ensure that I copy onto a straight line. So here I'm not holding Shift, here I'm holding Shift. I'm going to let go of my mouse, let go of my keyboard, and then I'm going to hit Control D 1, 2, 3 more times. Now I have 5 figures out here. Last thing I'll do is select all of these characters, Alt, click on one of them, drag it down. Now I'm holding Shift, and I just copied these down to create 10 characters. From here now, we could go to Window, Color, make sure our color palette is open. I could grab several of these figures. To do that, I could select multiples by holding down Shift and grabbing more. And I could simply change the color on those figures to, I don't know, a green color, like I had previously talked about. And then these two, maybe I'll go ahead and make those gray, indicating that these 8 figures have interest attached to them, whereas these two are kind of fading into the background. They're not as important. So that concludes the process. Just to review, we went through and we used our shape tool, our rectangle tool, to create a path. We played with color fill and stroke color and no fill. We modified that path by increasing the size of the stroke, and we changed that stroke quality to have rounded corners and rounded caps. We used our white arrow to select line segments and delete them. And we also took that path and we went Object, Path, Outline, Stroke to convert that path into a shape. Finally, we took two overlapping shapes and we used our pathfinder tool to unite those shapes into one. And from there, we went through and played with our white arrow to modify the way points looked by dragging down and tweaking those points. There were a lot of things that we covered through this exercise, but I think all of them are going to help you as you create illustrations for your infograph.